Hello, my name is Duane Wegener. I'm a professor here in the psychology department at Ohio State, and I'm here today to talk about cybersecurity. Oh, the humanity. Before I dive in, let me give a little bit of background on who I am academically. I'm a social psychologist. Mostly that means I am a basic scientist. I develop and I test theories that are related to persuasion and behavior change. Some of that work has also been applied to the areas of energy, health. I also have some current work on misinformation belief and the factors that influence the spread of that misinformation. Those interests in particular brought me in contact with folks in computer science and electrical and computer engineering, and thus through to cybersecurity. So, in terms of the goals that I have for the talk today, I really wasn't trying to be melodramatic in my title. For those in the audience that are maybe equal to or older than I am, you might have noticed the quotation of the commentary on the Hindenburg disaster in the title. Of course, I don't go back to 1937, but that footage certainly, I'd say, received more of the disaster related attention when I was younger than it probably does now. Um, Clearly, I don't need to emphasize to this audience that cybersecurity itself can be a big deal with far reaching consequences. And some of those can even be related to life and death if one's dealing, for example, with influences of emergency related misinformation or health related disinformation. Though I do study such things, I actually want today to make a bit of a more general point during our time together. That is, I want to emphasize that cybersecurity is about much more than technology. Cybersecurity is about human behavior. Like most of our cultural challenges, cybersecurity has human behavior as perhaps the greatest risk. And therefore, it's also perhaps the greatest lever that we can move to be capable of making improvements. And so, what I'd like to do then is uh, is not to provide a comprehensive view of human behavior. I think that human behavior comes into many different facets of cybersecurity. In fact, I won't even talk about the areas that I study most in terms of misinformation and its type of cybersecurity, but rather I want to give some examples of how we can take information about things like the user's various roles in their lives, the various responsibilities they might believe that they have, and how the experiences and goals that they have related to cybersecurity might contribute to how we can make efforts at cybersecurity awareness and training more effective. Okay, now, so as I mentioned, in the cybersecurity domain, people are often the weakest link. Even with the very best technology, that technology is limited if, for example, there is poor uptake by users, right? If users don't adopt the technologies or the software, the kinds of things that have been developed to help them stay secure, then that technology will not have helped very much. Of course, even if there is initial uptake, but if that is not adequately maintained or bolstered over time, or if there are simply lapses in practice, most of those things will come from problems in human behavior, the choices that people make to update a password or to make it a particularly strong or maybe not so strong but easier to remember for them kind of password. Those choices make all the difference. Right. Now, of course, you might imagine, well, maybe we could just require periodic training. We could lock down our systems. We could just keep people from messing up. And maybe some organizations take that kind of approach as their primary approach to cybersecurity. If they have, though, they've probably also had or seen a number of negative consequences that could come from that. right? If you go about frustrating your users, if that contributes to poor user morale, it probably, in to some degree, also ends up being reflected in disengagement from that cybersecurity enterprise by those users. And we know from a long run of psychological research that when people are forced to engage in an action, right, that they are especially unlikely to internalize that action or to view it as coming from their own goals and motives. And when that happens, that is likely to shut off any possibility of them kind of taking a self directed kind of seeking of that kind of action or that kind of information. And so, in the realm of cybersecurity, we should be especially concerned if people view it as something that is forced upon them and something that they would not, of their own accord, seek out and pursue. Because if they do adopt more of an internalized view, that is going to create the kind of self directed seeking of security related information that should really pay dividends down the road. Right. Now, I mentioned earlier that I study attitude change, right? I study persuasion. And one of the traditional reasons to study attitude change, to look at trying to create favorable attitudes or goals that foster particular kinds of actions, is because people carry their attitudes and their goals around with them, right? If you can get a person to like a particular topic, to have interest in it, or to be engaged in a particular action and to think of that as something that they choose to do, then you can create that self directed kind of pursuit of those actions or engagement in those topics, right? In comparison to that, a more compliance or top down kind of surveillance based process is very limited. It only works when the person feels like they are in a position where they are being surveilled, right? And it conveys to the person that no one really wants to do this. And as a user, then I might think, well, if no one wants to do this and they have to be forced, well, I don't want to do it either. Now, they might comply with whatever the baseline minimal kinds of requirements might be, but it may really, in the process, shut them off from ever doing any more than that. And in the realm of cybersecurity, it is often going to be really important for people to not just do the bare minimum, but in fact to get them into some kind of routine or habit, or at least something that they see as useful to them to pursue on their own and to continue to gain knowledge and skills in that area. And if we can form a goal on the part of users to improve their security practices, right? If we can get them to form a positive attitude toward such pursuits, then it's my view, at least, and perhaps from a psychological kind of psychology centric kind of view, that kind of goal, that positive attitude toward pursuit of security related information should pay those long term dividends. Now, I'm not saying that there would be no situation in which training is good to require or things like that. That's not necessarily the point. But what I'd like to assert is that in fact, um, other efforts or additional efforts often perhaps should come first. Right, that rather than a compliance based kind of approach, it may often be more fruitful to consider the reasons why people form that weakest link in cybersecurity efforts. What is it about those people, about those users, that gets in the way? Well, one of probably many factors, and I just want to pick out a few here, but one that comes to mind right away is that people have a limited number of focal or primary goals. And for many people, cybersecurity is just far down that list, right? So if you think, for example, about a faculty member here at Ohio State, right? Well, what exactly did Ohio State hire me to do? What are the primary responsibilities and expertise and such that I bring to Ohio State? Well, they expect me to be conducting research, to be teaching, to be mentoring both graduate and undergraduate students, and especially in their research, to be writing scientific articles, right? To be writing chapters, maybe even books, right? To be reviewing scientific articles, maybe editing scientific journals, serving on professional committees, department and college service. The list goes on and on before I ever get to quote unquote protect OSU data, right? At least for most faculty, I think that if they were listing out what are your primary goals, what are the primary things that draw your attention every day, cybersecurity is going to be far down that list if it is on there at all. Right. I tell my students one of the kind of perverse things about academia is that all of the most important activities that you have for your career actually have no deadlines whatsoever. Everything else has deadlines and requirements. And when you are working on something that has a deadline, that has a requirement, it's very easy for that to then be viewed as a quote unquote have to, not a quote unquote want to, right? And so that very system, if it's a more compliance based or requirement based system, conveys in and of itself to the users that this is something that you have to do, not something that you want to do. Right? Now, it may be even harder to bring cybersecurity to the top of that list when, in fact, in many parts of our organization, we have dedicated IT professionals, right? We have technical support. We have we have people that focus on cybersecurity. And for the everyday kind of user, it may be easy for that person to then view cybersecurity as a technology issue, as one that is not falling in my area of expertise, but there's someone else here who's supposed to be focusing on that. Right. So if I'm not in a position where I develop or directly implement the cybersecurity technologies, then as a kind of everyday user, I may not really think of cybersecurity as something that directly concerns me. Now, so far, I've focused on things like the roles that people have within the organization, with demands that are vying for that person's time and those kinds of issues. But I also want to acknowledge up front, and I will come back to this later, that there may also be more psychological or motivational reasons that people avoid dealing with cybersecurity. In particular, there are lots of threats involved with cybersecurity, and people in general often want to avoid threat. Right now, those threats could take different forms, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. I'll unpack some of those things a little later in the talk. Um, but when there are already reasons for the person to be focused elsewhere, that might especially make that person likely to kind of give in to that preference, to assume that things are fine and to avoid thinking about this kind of threatening kind of content that might be involved with what kinds of maybe risks I've either taken in the past, or that I might be tempted to take. Sometimes people would rather not know. And there are psychological reasons for that. And we'll talk a little bit more about those a little bit later. Now, is there kind of low hanging fruit? Is there a way that we can change this state of affairs in a relatively direct and in some ways maybe almost simple way? And I do think that one way that this could be addressed is to acknowledge the kind of divided attention and competing motives that users might have, and to put that user at the center of efforts to engage that person with cybersecurity training, to seek to form the kind of attitudes that help make learning about cybersecurity a more desired and typical part of their everyday lives. To use that knowledge of the user, of their roles, of what they think of as their responsibilities, Um, and to do that regarding not just their life inside the organization, but also outside of the organization as ways to engage them in the topic, to enhance their interest, and thereby their knowledge and eventually their skills. And so, what I'm really proposing is a full integration of behavioral science with the cybersecurity effort and cybersecurity training. And to me, at least, there's no better place than a university like Ohio State in which to do that. We have very strong social and behavioral sciences at Ohio State, and we should be taking full advantage of that expertise. And really, as a university, we should absolutely be supporting that kind of integration, as human behavior plays such a key role in almost any of the global challenges that the world faces. And that's true whether we're dealing with energy, health, security, all kinds of various domains in which we have huge global challenges. But human behavior is at the center and is often representing some of the most severe risks in those domains. Now, fortunately, I see a great deal of openness to these kinds of ideas, to this notion of a user-centric kind of consideration of human behavior in this system. In particular, I see this in the Ohio State Institute for Cybersecurity and Digital Trust. The approach of this institute, I think, is very much for cybersecurity to not only be about hardware and software, but really about people. And that's one reason that trust, in fact, is in the title, because trust is about people, about this community of information providers and consumers of that information, and can you trust the information one's receiving and use it. And so there's a very key part of that that is about developing and maintaining that kind of relationship across information providers and users and such. And the Institute itself, I know, is developing training programs that include behavioral, ethical, policy kinds of components to it. And I really look forward to seeing how all of that develops. We're still at the very beginning of some of those programs, but I really look forward to seeing how that all comes together. For today, I'd like to talk about how the behavioral side might especially play into attempts to increase cybersecurity awareness and knowledge of cybersecurity information and the skills that are there for the garden variety everyday kind of user like me. Right, someone whose focal attention is really drawn elsewhere, but and who's also not on the technical support side in my department, but for whom these issues are absolutely continuing to be relevant. How do we do that? Right. So, what I want to do to talk about that is to talk about the Cybersecurity for You platform here at Ohio State, or C4U. Right. The C4U is Ohio State's security awareness platform. I raise it here because I'm happy to say that it starts to take some of the aspects from the kind of approach that I'm suggesting, that really take that kind of user centric view of cybersecurity and broaden out beyond the particular person's role in, say, the university. Right. Now, I do want to be clear, C4U is not my platform, right? It's not something that I developed, but I've had some really interesting conversations with the people who do develop this and oversee it. And fortunately, they were also happy for me to use it as a means to talk about the human side of cybersecurity. I'm definitely interested in getting more involved with this platform. As I said, they've started to use what I think of as a very user centric kind of approach. And I see lots of opportunities for further building out of that kind of approach and more explicitly incorporating what we know from behavioral science. And so, in some ways, I think of the talk today as a kind of promissory note or kind of nuggets to think about for how user factors might be used to influence both initial and also continuing engagement in this domain. Now, as I understand it, the cybersecurity for you approach is to identify users' quote unquote pain points that might be related to cybersecurity and to provide relevant information and tools for those users. Now, by that, I don't mean that the system directly assesses users' needs. I think it would be great to incorporate more of that, more direct assessment of those kinds of things. But they have attempted to identify user concerns and to use those to help create interest in the platform and in the available information and to design activities that would address those needs. And interestingly, in the process, they also introduce then content that serves Ohio State's goals as well. And so the kind of notion is that you kind of entice people with maybe what you think of as cybersecurity snacks, right? These brief little activities that might address something that is desirable to the person. And then I think maybe the technical term was while they're taking part of those snacks, we slip in the cybersecurity vegetables, right? The idea is that people learn what the organization wants them to know, even if they don't necessarily realize that that's what they were learning. And so, for example, if a person goes onto the platform and pursues content that is about social media hacking, for example, right? They might have approached that thinking about how they can help protect their family's Facebook account or maybe their daughter's Instagram account or something like that. But while they're getting that information about social media hacking, they may actually pick up knowledge that is relevant to their, say, work related Twitter contacts or maybe other forms of actually work related communication, right? Um, now, um, there are all kinds of roles, however, that people might take, and I think that this is one of the low-hanging kind of fruits is if we can think through what kinds of roles one could use to draw people in to the system, right? If cybersecurity is not atop that person's roles within the organization and what their motives may be for what they want to accomplish at work, they may still have attention and motives from their roles elsewhere where they are in very different roles, right? So let me just give a brief example. When my parents retired and they moved to the city where I was on faculty at the time, they really kind of started to use email at that time. And they always had problems of one type or another, right? And I was really the only person they had to help them. And so even though I would repeatedly say I'm not technical support, this is not what I do, I still was pulled into that role when I would go to their house, right? And so if I had found resources that could have helped me in that role, that could have helped me give good guidance to them, or could have helped me figure out ways to either help them avoid the problems or help me to deal with them once they occurred, um, if that information had been available and I had gone to it, it probably would have been a very effective way to engage me at the time, and it likely would have helped me to know better how to keep my own work safe at the office or at home, in those kinds of situations. Right now, if one doesn't have retiring parents, many faculty or staff have younger kids, and they may be learning about social media, and parents may be concerned about how do we deal with social media and how do we keep our kids safe in that kind of domain. How can they partake in certain aspects of that without also taking undue risk? Right? And that could be another path that when one plays that role at home, even if it's totally divorced in their minds from what they do at work, that can be a way to get people drawn in to think about and to pursue cybersecurity awareness and information, right? Now, currently, the C4U platform does not gather a lot of information on relevant user roles or what kinds of things they would want to do as a user. right? What are their relevant roles? I do think that by collecting more of that, for example, maybe in the C4U profile or in some other way, could help them to direct users to resources that effectively engage their goals. Right now, there are lots of relevant and interesting activities, but right now they are kind of well, they're not very organized, right? They're kind of random. And for a person to go in and find what they need at the time is certainly more of an effort than it would have to be, and that perhaps it could be to draw people in more effectively. Right. A couple of other type of quick examples of other kinds of roles that might also be engaging to potential users. One typical kind of non-work context that definitely translates into key work-related threats involves travel. Right, at least whenever we can actually do that again. And in that context, people deal with issues like free Wi-Fi and how can I use that safely, using rideshare apps, all kinds of things, many topics of which are actually currently available in the C4U platform, but they're not yet packaged in ways that really direct the prospective traveler to find them through that kind of traveling hook, right? Similar kind of thing, for a homeowner or um, the kind of smart home, right? The Internet of Things, right? We have all these web connected devices now, even, your refrigerator and things like that. And so, people, it may seem great for the homeowner to say, hey, from my cell phone, I can control the lights, the doors, I can turn this off or on. Um, or maybe I can do it through a voice assistant of some sort, right? But what are the risks, right? And so again, there's information available in the C4U platform, but users are kind of left to find it on their own more so than being directed to it through some way of saying, well, what are my roles and responsibilities? What are the kinds of things I would be interested in? And there are probably fairly direct ways to identify those and use them as ways to make people aware of content that they would find relevant and engaging. Now, these are just a very few examples of roles that fall outside the kind of work organization context, but they could form a very clear pathway for engaging the interest and directing users to content that they would immediately find useful. Right. Now, from a psychological standpoint, at least, it seems like it would be very beneficial to take advantage of those roles and to take advantage of the responsibilities or motives that accompany those roles to direct people to relevant security related content. Right. And a lot of that, of course, would have significant um, overflow relevance to the Ohio State setting. Right. And so it seems like a win win kind of thing, both for the users and for the organization. And once you have that good, firm connection made, right, that there is relevant information for me at this platform, that I can get good nuggets of brief activities that I find very useful, then they should be much more likely to come back and explore further. They should be more likely to be able to feel able to find things that they are interested in, that would be a first go-to place for them to look. And I think that would even be enhanced further if they were able to search somehow by those roles, or if somehow the activities, one way to get to them might be by grouping them in bundles that somehow reflect knowledge of typical roles and contexts that everyday users would face and would find as pathways that get them to come to seek security related information. Right. Now, roles and responsibilities could be one way to target the right kind of information for particular users, and to find information that directly speaks to the perceived needs and responsibilities of that person. But as we get deeper into the links between behavioral science and cybersecurity, I also want to note that it will become inescapable that users' experiences, even their emotional states and the motives that accompany them, um, would also come into play and could, in fact, be informative. And so, I mentioned earlier that there is often an inherent threat in information about cybersecurity, right? Of course, there's a potential for loss, and the potential for harm, either that's already been done and one doesn't know about it, or that could happen, um, can be experienced as threatening. And one of the key principles related to psychological approaches to threat concerns whether or not people believe themselves to be capable of dealing with that threat. If they do believe themselves as capable, they react to the threat more as a challenge, right? They engage, approach the threat, and they deal with it. But if they do not believe that they are equipped, then instead they can try to avoid the threat, they'll withdraw from it, and they may in fact fall into a much more maladaptive spiral. And that would be the kind of situation where they may just go focus on other matters altogether as a way to try to avoid thinking about that threat. Right. Of course, we wouldn't want them to do that, right? We would want to set up people more to view cybersecurity as a challenge rather than a threat. So that would be one of our goals in how to communicate about cybersecurity. Another aspect of threat that actually we're examining in my lab in the health domain, but seems quite relevant here, concerns whether people might react differently to threats that they see as a threat directly to themselves versus to other people that they care about in their lives, right? And so sometimes when the threat to self might be so great that people really want to avoid it, the very same threat that is posed to others, like close friends or family in one's life, may in fact be met with engagement in order to take action or pass along relevant information to that close other who is threatened. Right. And by bypassing the motives to avoid self threat, we might actually be able to get the person to engage with information that would not only end up helping that close other, right, but would also help the person in the process. And so, just like we might engage people with roles outside of work to convey information that will be helpful at work, here we might be able to get people to engage with threats that are to others in their lives, and in the process gain information that they will find applicable and useful to deal with any threats in their own lives, which may in fact in the process then get them to view that threat as really a challenge that they can, in fact, engage with and deal with. Right now, because related topic to threat, and a much more general one and kind of diffuse, is the inherent uncertainty that people may be experiencing. They could be experiencing uncertainty before they ever engage with cybersecurity. They could just have a lot of uncertainty about what they might learn if they do in fact engage with cybersecurity. And so, for example, if they imagine, oh, what if I learn that I've been putting myself and my family at risk all these years, that may be something that they really don't want to approach, especially if they think that they can be experiencing more certainty by focusing on the other things in their life and not on cybersecurity. Right. And that may mean that people might often question whether in fact they'll be up to the task, relating back to that challenge versus threat issue. And they might also question how much effort it might take away from their primary duties if they were to really dive into cybersecurity and become enough of an expert to do something about it. Right, in a more extreme version of that uncertainty, perhaps they might even fear what they would learn. And I just want to mention that there are whole literatures in psychology about how people deal with threat. I've talked about some of that, how they deal with uncertainty and even with fear, and how one might shift communications when you're dealing with someone who's experiencing those states. And so we can use that knowledge, right, at perhaps a more developed state of the kind of behavioral cybersecurity awareness nexus, right? we might take advantage of those kinds of literatures to shift how one talks about particular cybersecurity topics, right? Or, for example, if particular topics are routinely associated with certain kinds of concerns, certain kinds of uncertainties, or with fear, right? Then perhaps just in general, the language that is used on the C4U platform, for example, describing the activity, might be formed in such a way that we could maximize engagement, that we could maximize, for example, the sense that the person would have that the fear that they have will be addressed and that this activity will, in fact, be a means to help them overcome or avoid whatever it is that was creating that fear in the first place. Right. Now, these are only a small subset of the potentially relevant states or experiences that people might have. Right. Security related topics might also engender states like frustration or even anger, possibly other states. Indeed, some cybersecurity protocols might even themselves create such states, which is probably not a great way to create persisting favorable attitudes toward or motives for pursuing those kinds of cybersecurity protocols. And so taking those kinds of things into account may be useful in a whole variety of ways. Now, just to kind of wrap up, I noted at the beginning that this was not meant to be an exhaustive discussion of a behavioral psychological kind of angle on cybersecurity or even on cybersecurity awareness and training. But by focusing on the roles and emotional states that might be considered, I hopefully gave you some idea of how a user centric kind of approach might look. In doing so, I probably gave short shrift to the roles of other kinds of psychological constructs like beliefs about cybersecurity or knowledge about one's capabilities or about potential benefits of pursuing security related information and the like. So there's certainly this was not an exhaustive treatment of even how a user centric kind of approach might play out. But hopefully, I have convinced you to some degree, I hope, that human behavior plays a key role in all of this, right? When we're thinking about cybersecurity, I hope that it didn't take a lot of persuading for this group to realize that people are often the weakest link in cybersecurity systems. And yet, many cybersecurity academic programs are all about the hardware and the software rather than incorporating an understanding of human behavior or why people end up being the vulnerability that they might be in that system. Right. Um, a second and key point, something that kind of organized everything I wanted to talk about today, was to say that taking knowledge of the users, who they are, what their goals are, what they see as their responsibilities and the motives that might go with that, that knowledge should be used to create a positive dynamic surrounding cybersecurity awareness and training. That doing so has a great deal of potential to better engage users and to create that kind of self-directed and sustainable information seeking over time in the cybersecurity domain. Um, and in doing so, even when we're taking an organization's point of view, even if we think about it from the Ohio State point of view, um, the relevant information that we might use about the user extends far beyond that person's role or responsibilities at Ohio State. Often one's role in the organization could even serve as a demotivator for paying attention to cybersecurity when, for example, they think that it's someone else's responsibility at the organization, right? Um, in fact, it may be more effective for us to use the roles and states and motives of the person outside the organization. The roles that they play with family or friends might actually be incredibly useful to the organization as providing a pathway in to make the kind of connection with cybersecurity information and resources, and to create the kind of positive dynamic that will keep that developing over time. Using such knowledge, hopefully, and I think would provide a robust path for us to increase the kind of self-directed behavior change that best serves cybersecurity goals. Right. Now, I look forward to continuing dialogue and interaction with the Cybersecurity for You platform. If you have not tried it out, please take a look at cybersecurityforyou.osu.edu, or just c4u.osu.edu. You can log in there with your name, number, your regular login information for the university. If you are a faculty member or a graduate student interested in getting involved in cybersecurity efforts that center around human behavior, please feel free to reach out to me at wegener.one@osu.edu. That every other letter is an E, Wegener.one. I have not been here, the whole time that I was a .one, but I was a graduate student here at Ohio State when we started the name .number system, and so I ended up with .one. And I want to mention that there are lots of departments in pretty much every college around campus that focus on human behavior in one way or another. And I absolutely believe that as an institute, as a university, we should take advantage of all of that expertise. And so I hope that that you will think about being involved with that if it's relevant to your expertise within the university. Right. Um, I also look forward to the anticipated offerings on the academic and training side, as well as on the research side, through the Institute for Cybersecurity and Digital Trust, and its affiliated and really under development academic programs. I know that many of those efforts will integrate individual human behavior as well as the social policy government kinds of portions of the equation that are also, of course, very human behavior oriented. And will work to integrate that and show the relations of those things to technology development and use. I very much look forward to those developments in the coming years. And so thank you very much for your interest in Cybersecurity Days and also in today's topic.